My son looked me in the eye and said I was a burden. Then he and his wife tried to steal the house I built with my late wife. But what they didn't realize was that I had already outsmarted them at every turn. Hit subscribe if you believe life always finds a way to balance the scales. Because this story proves it. My son Mark had always had a temper I didn't fully understand. I thought, as a father, I had raised him well. I thought the values of respect, honesty, and compassion had been embedded in him, like the foundation of the house I had built with my late wife, Susan, over 30 years ago. That house had seen everything. My children learning to walk birthdays, Christmas mornings, laughter echoing through the living room, and countless family dinners. It had been our fortress, a testament to years of hard work and sacrifice. And now, it was the source of a storm I hadn't seen coming. That evening, I had driven into the driveway feeling unusually tense. Something about the way Mark had answered my phone call earlier had left a knot in my stomach. I told myself it was nothing. Perhaps he was tired from work. Perhaps Jenna, his wife, had been nagging him about bills again. But deep down, I knew the unease in my chest wasn't going to fade that easily. As soon as I entered the house, I noticed the way they looked at me. Like I was an inconvenience, a shadow that didn't belong in their carefully curated life. Mark was sprawled across the couch, phone in hand, earbuds in, pretending to be too busy to notice me. Jenna glanced up from the tablet she was scrolling, barely masking a smirk, and went back to whatever world she had immersed herself in. I greeted them politely, my voice calm, perhaps too calm. Mark. Jenna, how was your day? Mark didn't even bother taking out his earbuds. Busy, he mumbled. I sighed inwardly. I'd learned to weather this storm of indifference over the years, but there was something different tonight. Something sharper. Something that prickled at the edges of my patience. We sat down for dinner, and the tension was almost palpable. I had prepared his favorite meal, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, hoping to lighten the mood. But my efforts seemed to amuse them more than anything else. They exchanged glances and whispered, making me feel like an outsider in my own home. Then, without warning, Mark leaned back and said the words I dreaded for months, the ones that cut deeper than any knife. You're a burden, Dad. For a moment I didn't breathe. I couldn't. The words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and heavy. My own son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, who had once clung to my hand on first days of school, now looked at me as if I were a problem he had no patience for. Jenna laughed, a sharp, high-pitched sound that made my chest tighten. Yeah. Seriously, she said, swirling her wine glass with deliberate slowness. You should really consider, downsizing. Maybe a little retirement home. I blinked, trying to process the humiliation. I wanted to stand up, to tell them they had no right, but the words got caught in my throat. My hands, trembling slightly, rested on the table. My heart pounded, a rhythmic reminder of the betrayal, and then it happened. Jenna, with a mischievous smirk, deliberately tipped her wine glass. Red liquid cascaded across my plate, splattering my shirt. I gasped, trying to shield myself, but the damage was done. The smell of wine mixed with the taste of my own helplessness, and I felt a surge of anger I had never felt toward my own family. Mark laughed, not in a joking way, but in a way that made it clear he was enjoying my discomfort. Oops, sorry, Dad, he said mockingly. Clumsy me. I stared at them, at the son I had nurtured, the woman I had welcomed into my family, and realized that this wasn't just a moment of carelessness. This was deliberate. This was contempt. They had crossed a line I didn't know I had left unguarded. I excused myself from the table, retreating to the kitchen to clean up the mess. My hands shook, not just from the shock, but from the rage simmering beneath my skin. I wanted to confront them, to shout, to make them understand that their behavior was unacceptable, but I also knew that any outburst would play into their hands. They thrived on my reactions. They wanted me to be small, weak, dependent. While scrubbing the red stain from my shirt, I overheard them through the slightly open kitchen door. They were whispering, voices low but urgent, conspiratorial. "He won't know until it's too late," Mark said. "The papers are almost ready. By next week it'll be ours." I froze. My blood ran cold. What papers? My house, my life's work, the home that held memories of Susan, of family holidays, of laughter and love. The thought that my own son and his wife were plotting to take it from me was unbearable. I retreated to my study, hands trembling, heart hammering against my chest. I sat down at my old wooden desk, the one that had been in the family for generations, and opened my laptop. I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about pride or anger. This was about survival, about protecting everything I had built, everything my wife and I had worked for. I drafted a quick text to my lawyer, fingers shaking. "Mark and Jenna are plotting to take my house. Please advise immediately. This is urgent." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. My lawyer, someone I trusted implicitly, would know how to proceed. As I sat back in my chair, a wave of conflicting emotions crashed over me. Anger, sadness, betrayal. A sense of disbelief, so sharp it cut through every ounce of composure I had left. I had raised my son with all the care and patience I could muster, teaching him right from wrong, instilling in him the values that my own father had tried to teach me. And yet here he was, scheming against me, with a smile on his face and a plan to erase my place in the world. But amidst the storm of emotions, a small spark of resolve ignited. I realized something crucial: I had weathered storms before. I had faced hardships that would have broken most men. I had survived loss, grief, and betrayal. And now I would survive this. I would outsmart them. I would protect what was mine, not out of greed, but out of principle, out of respect for the life I had built and the memory of the woman I had loved. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet of the study envelop me. In the shadows of that room, with the faint light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls, I began to plan. Every detail, every misstep they might take, every document, every conversation, they would all be accounted for. They didn't know it yet, but the game had already begun. And in that moment, I felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. The house they sought to claim, by deceit, was more than walls and furniture. It was my legacy, my memories, my life. They were playing with fire, and I was ready to burn it, not in anger, but in calculated precision. Mark and Jenna might have thought they were clever, but they underestimated me. They underestimated the quiet strength of a man who had survived more than they could imagine, who had loved deeply, who had lost deeply, and who had emerged not broken, but wiser, more cunning, more determined. The night stretched on, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sat at my desk plotting, remembering, steeling myself for what was to come. I knew one thing for certain: the next time they tried to humiliate me, to rob me of my home and dignity, I would be ready. And when the moment came, I would show them that the heart of a father, even in the twilight of his life, could be sharper and stronger than the greed of those who had forgotten respect. After that night, I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the house, every faint sound of movement made my stomach knot with anxiety. Mark and Jenna weren't just reckless. They were plotting against me, and I had no intention of letting them succeed. I realized I needed to know exactly why they were so desperate for my house. Was it money? Was it ego? Or was it something far worse? The next morning, I began quietly observing them. Every interaction, every glance, every whispered conversation I could overhear, I cataloged it in my mind. They were careful, but not careful enough. Their eyes darted toward the study, when they thought I wasn't looking. They laughed a little too quickly at each other's jokes, the kind of laughter that covers fear and guilt. Then I discovered the first piece of the puzzle. A stack of bills slipped carelessly out of Mark's briefcase as he left for work. I waited until he was gone and carefully sorted through them. My heart sank as I realized the truth. Mark's business was failing. Not marginally failing, failing spectacularly. There were notices from creditors, reminders of late payments, foreclosure threats, and a credit card balance so high that even my modest savings would struggle to cover it. Jenna's name appeared on some of the bills too, showing that she wasn't just complicit, but actively involved. Anger surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. This explained a lot: the sudden interest in my house, the calculated humiliation, the desperate whispers. They weren't doing it out of malice for the sake of cruelty. They were desperate, scared, and greedy. But desperation didn't justify betrayal. Not in my house, not in my life, not in my family. I spent the next few days quietly gathering information. I checked the mailbox they often ignored. I looked through the file cabinet where old legal papers were kept. And then I found something that froze my blood. Hidden among papers I had forgotten about was a partially filled document, a property transfer form with my name on it. Only one page was signed, but it was enough to show intent. Mark and Jenna were planning to make the house theirs, legally, while I was still living in it. I felt a surge of disbelief, followed immediately by a determination I hadn't felt in years. They had crossed a line. They weren't just disrespectful. They were criminals in the making, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. That evening, I decided to confront them, not directly, but indirectly. I played the role of the confused father, the aging man overwhelmed by the pace of modern life. I asked Mark to explain the papers I had found, pretending I didn't already know the truth. He laughed nervously, trying to appear casual. "Oh, Dad, just some routine stuff. You don't need to worry about it." Jenna chimed in, feigning concern. "Yeah, honey, you've done enough worrying already. Let us handle the boring stuff for you." I smiled faintly, hiding the storm inside. They had no idea I had already planned my moves. I had sent a text to my lawyer, and he had responded immediately, outlining the steps we could take to protect the property. I also decided to document everything myself. Hidden cameras, discreet recordings, any proof I could gather that would expose their intentions and protect me in court. Days turned into a tense rhythm. I observed their every move while maintaining the face, aid of the frail, confused father. I kept up appearances, smiling when they entered the room, asking polite questions, and nodding along to their suggestions about downsizing or simplifying life. All the while, I collected evidence quietly, systematically, carefully. One afternoon, I decided to check the paperwork again. As I suspected, someone had already forged my signature on one of the pages. My stomach turned, but I didn't panic. I photographed the page, noting the date and time, and carefully returned it to its place. Whoever thought this was a small act of deceit had underestimated the consequences. I also started digging into Mark's business. The more I learned, the clearer the picture became. He had made reckless investments, borrowed heavily from friends and family, and now faced potential bankruptcy. I realized Jenna was even worse. She had been quietly siphoning funds from Mark's accounts, creating a web of debt that neither of them could escape. It was desperation, yes, but also deceit. They were tangled in their lies, and their greed was going to be their undoing. One evening, I overheard a conversation that chilled me to the bone. They were sitting in the living room, unaware I was listening from the hallway. "Next week, when Dad's gone for his doctor's appointment, we'll have the papers ready," Jenna said, her voice low but urgent. "Good," Mark replied. Once it's done, we won't have to worry about money for the next 10 years. He'll never see it coming. My hands clenched into fists. I had always feared this day might come, but hearing it confirmed in their own voices brought a new level of determination. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to outsmart them completely. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. I met with my lawyer in secret, discussing options for immediate protection of the property. We drafted contingency plans, updated the will, and ensured that all legal avenues were covered. I even considered moving assets temporarily to secure accounts, knowing full well that if they tried to access them, they would find the doors locked. I also reflected on the emotional toll. Mark had been my pride and joy once, my reason for getting up every morning when Susan had passed. And now, he was my adversary. It pained me more than I could describe, yet that pain transformed into focus. I reminded myself that my fight wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, respect, and survival. Every night, I reviewed my evidence. Hidden cameras captured casual remarks, whispers about debts, and attempts to manipulate me into signing forms I didn't understand. I even recorded a few conversations with them, where they tried to gaslight me, pretending that I was imagining their intentions. Each recording became another piece of armor, another layer of protection for what was mine. One afternoon, I ran into a neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who had always been observant of the goings on at my house. She leaned close and whispered, "I've seen them sneaking around the property at odd hours. I think they're planning something." Her words were both comforting and alarming. Comforting, because I wasn't alone in noticing their suspicious behavior. Alarming, because it confirmed my fears that they weren't just careless. They were deliberate. I spent that evening reinforcing security, making sure doors and windows were locked and that cameras were well positioned. Every precaution, no matter how small, mattered now. I realized this wasn't just about a house. It was about standing up to betrayal, about showing Mark and Jenna that they couldn't manipulate and deceive me without consequence. By the end of the week, I felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. I had uncovered their motives, gathered evidence, and consulted legal counsel. I had prepared for confrontation, not out of anger, but out of necessity. They had underestimated me, and that underestimation was going to be their downfall. That night, as I sat alone in the study, I allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection. Susan's picture on the mantel seemed to watch over me, her eyes filled with silent approval. I whispered a promise to her memory. They won't take what we built. Not while I'm here. I felt the fire inside me grow. Not a fire of anger, but a fire of determination. Mark and Jenna had made a grave mistake. They had assumed I was weak, that age had diminished my cunning, that grief had left me vulnerable. But they were wrong. I had survived loss, betrayal, and hardship before. I had learned to read people, to anticipate their moves, to turn their own schemes against them. And now, I was ready. The next morning I watched them from the window as they left for work. They smiled at each other, unaware that every step they took toward their scheme was being observed, recorded, and cataloged. They thought the house would be theirs soon. They thought I was unaware. And I let them believe that, because the best victories are the ones your opponent never sees coming. I sat back, letting the silence of the house sink in. The storm had not yet hit, but the first winds were beginning to stir. The pieces were in place. All that remained was for the confrontation to unfold. And when it did, I knew that I would emerge, not just as the survivor of this betrayal, but as the master of the game that Mark and Jenna had foolishly thought they could win. Mark and Jenna had grown bolder. They no longer bothered to disguise their impatience or their scheming glances. It was as though they believed the house, The life my wife and I had built was theirs by default. They had pushed past subtle manipulation into a realm of outright control, and I realized that the next phase of their plan was imminent. They began isolating me in small ways. First, it was canceling appointments that I had made with my doctor, pretending they had already handled it. When I noticed the missed calls and rescheduled, Jenna would assure me with a saccharine smile, "Oh, don't worry, Dad. We've got it all under control. You need rest more than anything." Mark would nod, pretending to agree. It was subtle, but effective. They were trying to weaken me, make me dependent, make me doubt myself. One evening, they staged an argument. Mark raised his voice just enough to be overheard, Jenna throwing in cutting remarks about how difficult it was to care for me. I played my part perfectly, looking tired, confused, vulnerable. I even allowed myself to slump in my chair, as though the weight of their criticism had broken me. They exchanged victorious glances, convinced I had fallen into the trap. Meanwhile, I had been documenting everything meticulously. Hidden cameras captured their conversations and manipulations. Every action, every cruel remark, every attempt to deceive me was recorded. I also began testing their reactions, pretending to be more forgetful than usual, leaving documents in obvious places, watching them fumble as they tried to manipulate me into signing. They had no idea that every misstep was being noted, every attempt to force me into submission cataloged for later. One afternoon, Mark decided to escalate. He suggested, with a false air of concern, that I consider moving into a retirement community. "It'll be safer, Dad," he said, leaning forward as though he was offering a kind solution. "You won't have to worry about maintenance, bills, or anything like that. We can take care of everything for you." Jenna chimed in, nodding vigorously. "Yes, you've done so much for us, Dad. You deserve peace. Let us handle the house. You'll be happier in a smaller place." Their smiles were dripping with deceit, but I played along. I allowed them to believe I was considering their suggestions, that I might be persuaded to leave. Every nod, every sigh, every hesitant question I asked was calculated to make them comfortable, to draw them into believing their plan was working. At the same time, I had quietly finalized arrangements with my lawyer. Every contingency was covered. The property was protected through a trust, my accounts secured, and legal documentation prepared to expose any attempt at forgery or coercion. I had become a quiet predator in my own home, patiently waiting for the moment when their arrogance would leave them vulnerable. I also reached out to neighbors discreetly, gathering statements and observations. Many had noticed Mark and Jenna's strange behavior, the way they loitered near the property, the subtle aggression in their interactions. Each account became another piece of evidence, another layer of protection against the deceit I was certain was coming. One evening, I overheard them talking about a supposed final push. They planned to submit paperwork while I was away for a routine doctor's appointment. "He'll never notice until it's done," Jenna said, a note of triumph in her voice. Mark nodded, confident, arrogant, convinced that the house would soon be theirs. I let them believe it. I even mentioned casually that I had an appointment scheduled, knowing they would see it as an opportunity. They had underestimated me. They thought they were clever, but in reality, they had walked straight into a trap of their own making. The day of the appointment arrived. I dressed carefully, appearing frail and distracted. I waved to them with a weak smile as I left the house, making sure to linger at the door, giving the impression that I was vulnerable, unaware, and fully trusting of them. Mark and Jenna exchanged excited glances, certain that their moment had come. But I had arranged for my lawyer to monitor the situation in real time. Every move they made, every attempt to access or manipulate documents, was being observed. Cameras recorded them, Notes were taken, and evidence was preserved. Their overconfidence was their greatest weakness. As I returned from the appointment, I noticed subtle changes in their demeanor. The tension was palpable, their usual smug confidence faltering. I walked through the door calmly, deliberately, and greeted them as though nothing had happened. "Did you manage the house while I was out?" I asked, voice light, smiling faintly. Mark stammered, caught off guard by my composure. Jenna tried to cover, but her forced calm was obvious. The first crack in their armor had appeared, and I knew it was only the beginning. I allowed the next few days to pass without confrontation, continuing to collect evidence, to reinforce security, to prepare for the inevitable clash. Every conversation, every interaction, every suggestion they made was met with calm questions, subtle challenges, or feigned confusion that forced them to reveal more of their plan than they realized. It was during one of these days that I realized how much I had underestimated the psychological impact of my own patience. Mark and Jenna grew frustrated, their whispers turning into arguments, their movements hasty and careless. They were making mistakes, exposing their intentions, confirming every suspicion I had documented. One afternoon, Mark stormed into the study, slamming a folder of papers onto the desk. "Why are you always listening?" he demanded, his face red with frustration. "We're just trying to help." I looked at him calmly, leaning back in my chair, hands folded. "I'm just making sure everything is in order." "Mark," I said softly, as though nothing was out of the ordinary. "You wouldn't want me signing something I don't understand, would you?" Jenna appeared behind him, her face a mask of irritation and fear. "Dad, please. Don't make this harder than it has to be. We're trying to do what's best." I smiled faintly, a small, knowing smile that I could see unnerved them both. They didn't realize that their rush, their frustration, their overconfidence was feeding my preparation. Each attempt to manipulate me, each dishonest word, each false act of kindness was a step closer to their downfall. That night, I sat alone in the study, reviewing every piece of evidence I had gathered: recordings, hidden camera footage, neighbor statements, partially forged documents. Every piece painted a picture of intent, greed, and betrayal. I felt no hatred, no desire for revenge beyond what was necessary to protect myself. I felt clarity, focus, and a profound sense of justice. I knew the next phase was coming. Mark and Jenna would try again, perhaps even escalate further. But I was ready. I had anticipated their moves, prepared for their schemes, and laid the groundwork for the moment when the truth would be revealed. The house, our home, the life Susan and I had built, would not fall into the hands of those who had abandoned respect, love, and loyalty. And as I sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the house, I allowed myself a small, private smile. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for them to take the bait. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a quiet, tense weight that settled over the house. I dressed carefully, the lines of age and experience etched into my face, giving me an air of calm authority. This was not the first time I had faced a challenge, nor the first time I had been underestimated, but it felt monumental in a way that few conflicts ever do. My lawyer met me at the courthouse, papers in hand, eyes steady and reassuring. Together, we moved through the building, prepared, collected, and resolute. Mark and Jenna arrived shortly after, their faces painted with a combination of arrogance and forced civility. They were confident, convinced that the forged signatures and hastily executed plans would secure them the house. Their smiles were tight, their posture overly deliberate. I noticed the subtle tension in Jenna's fingers, the way Mark's eyes flickered toward the courtroom doors, as if he was anticipating a quick victory. The hearing began, and the first hour was procedural, dry and slow. I sat quietly, letting them speak first. allowing their own arrogance to fill the room. They presented their case with the kind of practiced, polished language that only people certain of their perceived entitlement can muster. "We've acted in good faith," Mark began, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "We simply want to ensure the family property is managed responsibly. Dad's health has made decisions difficult, and we're trying to help." I listened, unmoving, letting each word sink into my mind. Then, when it was my turn, I spoke with deliberate calm, outlining my version of events. My voice was steady, measured, and filled with a quiet authority that seemed to unnerve them. "I have lived in this house for over 30 years, I said. "Building it with my late wife, raising my children within its walls, and preserving it as a home. What has been presented here is an attempt to manipulate, deceive, and take possession of what is not yours by right or by law." The lawyer then began presenting the evidence I had gathered over weeks. Photographs of forged documents, recordings of conversations where Mark and Jenna explicitly discussed transferring the property, and statements from neighbors confirming suspicious activity. One by one, each piece was laid out in the courtroom, each revelation tightening the noose around their carefully constructed narrative. Mark's confidence began to waver. I noticed it in the subtle twitch of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the edge of the table. Jenna's mask of composure slipped slightly as well, the forced calm replaced by a flicker of panic in her eyes. The court reporter typed rapidly, capturing the exchanges, the objections, the confirmations of deceit. I could feel the tide turning with every new piece of proof presented. Then came the moment that I had been preparing for, the reveal of the trust. My lawyer explained, with precision and clarity, that the house had been legally transferred into a trust designed to protect the property from unauthorized claims. "Any attempt to claim the property without proper authorization," he said, "is legally invalid and will be treated as an act of fraud." The reaction in the courtroom was immediate. Mark and Jenna gasped, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to form words, only to be swallowed by disbelief. The judge leaned forward, brow furrowed, clearly taking in the gravity of the situation. This was no ordinary case of family disagreement. This was a case of attempted deception and fraud, meticulously documented and irrefutably proven. Jenna attempted to interrupt, to argue, but the judge silenced her with a firm gesture. "Order in the court," the judge said, voice sharp. "Any further attempt to misrepresent facts will result in immediate consequences." Mark's voice trembled as he tried to justify himself. "We were just trying to help," he stammered. "Dad, we didn't mean any harm." I looked at him, calm but unwavering, the weight of my years and experience settling between us. "Intent does not erase action, Mark," I said softly. "What you and Jenna attempted is illegal. What you attempted is a betrayal, and it will not stand." The judge reviewed the documents, the recordings, and the neighbor statements carefully. With each reference, the tension in the courtroom grew, the air thick with anticipation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke. "It is clear that the defendants engaged in deliberate and premeditated actions to transfer property under false pretenses. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, and any claims to the property are hereby nullified." A wave of relief washed over me. It wasn't joy that I felt. It was justice. It was the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing right had prevailed over deceit. Mark and Jenna slumped in their chairs, their arrogance replaced with humiliation and shock. Their plan, which they had executed with such confidence, had crumbled completely. The judge continued, issuing a restraining order to ensure that Mark and Jenna could not enter the property without permission and ordering an investigation into the attempted forgery and fraud. It was a legal safeguard, a shield around my home, and a final, undeniable statement that their actions would have consequences. As we left the courtroom, the weight of the ordeal began to lift slightly. My lawyer clapped me on the shoulder, a small but significant gesture of support. "You handled this with patience and intelligence," he said. "They underestimated you completely." I nodded, my mind already turning to what came next. The house was secure, yes, but there was more to consider. Mark and Jenna were not just adversaries in court. They were family. There would be emotional fallout, difficult conversations, and hard boundaries to maintain. But I felt ready. I had anticipated this. I had prepared for this. And I had emerged not only victorious but also wiser. Returning home, I walked through the familiar rooms, taking in the sunlight streaming through the windows, the quiet hum of the old refrigerator, the faint scent of Susan's favorite flowers that I had placed in the kitchen. This house was more than walls and furniture. It was a repository of memory, of love, of life lived fully. And it was mine. I knew Mark and Jenna would need to face the consequences of their actions, but I also knew that bitterness and revenge were not my goals. My goal was protection, justice, and the preservation of what truly mattered. The rest, I allowed the law and the universe to handle. Later that evening, I sat quietly in the living room, reflecting on the ordeal. There was an unexpected serenity in knowing that truth, diligence, and patience had triumphed over deceit. The house was secure, the documents were in order, and the legal safeguards ensured that no one could undermine the life I had built. And yet, amidst the calm, I felt a surge of hope. Hope that Mark could learn, that perhaps he could understand the gravity of his actions, and that Jenna, too, might recognize the consequences of greed and dishonesty. I knew this wouldn't erase the pain or humiliation, but it might pave the way for accountability and, eventually, a chance at reconciliation on fair terms. I looked out the window at the garden, the familiar sight of flowers swaying gently in the breeze, and I realized that while Mark and Jenna had sought to take the house, they had underestimated the strength, resolve, and foresight of a man defending his life's work. They had learned, the hard way, that deceit and greed do not triumph over patience, planning, and integrity. And in that quiet moment, I allowed myself to smile, knowing that the battle had been won, justice had been served, and my home, our home, was safe once more. The days after the court case were quieter, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with relief and the slow, steady return of control over my life and my home. Mark and Jenna no longer had access, no longer had the power to manipulate or humiliate me. The legal safeguards, the restraining order, and the trust I had established ensured that the house, and the memories it held, were protected. Walking through the familiar rooms, I could finally breathe. I spent mornings in the garden, tending to flowers that Susan had loved, their colors vibrant reminders of life continuing despite hardship. I reflected on the ordeal, thinking about the son I had raised and the choices he had made. The betrayal still stung, but it was tempered by clarity and perspective. I realized that this wasn't just about a house. It was about lessons learned, boundaries established, and respect earned through patience and foresight. Mark attempted to reach out once, sending a hesitant message, "Dad, I'm sorry." I didn't understand. I read it carefully and set it aside, choosing my response with deliberation. Forgiveness, I knew, would not come from impulsive emotion, but from careful consideration and boundaries that needed to be respected. I replied briefly, acknowledging his words, but making it clear that rebuilding trust would take time, and only on terms that ensured respect and responsibility. Jenna, too, seemed to vanish from the picture. Her calls went unanswered, her attempts to explain or justify herself met with silence. I allowed the space to exist, recognizing that both of them needed to face the consequences of their actions, not merely through legal channels, but through personal reflection. As the weeks passed, I focused on restoring the house to the warmth and comfort it had always held. Small renovations, repainting rooms, replacing furniture that had grown worn with time. All of it was done with care, a quiet reclamation of the space that had been threatened. Every action was symbolic, a renewal of life, a reclamation of dignity, and a celebration of the home that Susan and I had built together. I also began to think about the future, about who this home would belong to when I was no longer here. The trust ensured that Mark could not inherit through deceit, but I wanted to leave the house to someone who would cherish it, who would respect it as a place of love and memory. The decision came naturally, my granddaughter. She was young, full of curiosity and joy, and her laughter reminded me of Susan in ways that were both comforting and bittersweet. I spoke to her one afternoon in the living room, sunlight streaming through the windows. "This house has seen a lot," I said, gently holding her hands. "It's a place of love, of family, and it belongs to someone who will respect that. One day, it will be yours." She looked up at me with wide eyes, a mixture of awe and excitement, and nodded solemnly. I felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the house would continue to be a sanctuary, untouched by the greed and betrayal I had faced. Despite the legal victory and the security of the home, I allowed myself moments of introspection. I thought about Mark, the son I had loved unconditionally, and the choices that had led him down this path. It pained me to see someone I had nurtured make such mistakes, but I recognized the importance of boundaries and the necessity of allowing natural consequences to teach lessons that words alone could not. There were moments of quiet sadness, too, when I thought of Susan and the life we had shared. Her presence was everywhere in the house. The photographs on the mantel, the carefully tended garden, the warmth of the kitchen that had been the heart of our home. I spoke to her often in my thoughts, sharing the victories, the lessons, and the small moments of joy that returned to the house. In many ways, it was her spirit that guided me, steady and unwavering, reminding me that patience and integrity were more powerful than deceit and greed. Mark reached out one final time requesting a meeting. I agreed, but only under strict boundaries, ensuring that the conversation would be measured, respectful, and controlled. When we met, he broke down, tears in his eyes, expressing regret and acknowledging his mistakes. I listened, offering empathy, but also making it clear that forgiveness was not immediate. It would take time, consistent actions, and a recognition of the consequences to rebuild any form of trust. The encounter was emotional, but necessary. It allowed both of us to confront the reality of the past, to articulate regrets, and to define the path forward. I realized that protecting my home and asserting my rights had not been an act of vengeance, but an act of teaching, guiding, and establishing boundaries. It was a demonstration that respect and responsibility could not be assumed. They had to be earned. In the evenings, I would sit by the window, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood, the gentle rustling of trees, and the occasional laughter of my granddaughter playing outside. The house was safe. My memories were intact, and I was no longer living under the shadow of fear or manipulation. There was a profound sense of closure, a sense that justice and patience had carried the day. I reflected on the journey, the humiliation, the betrayal, the meticulous planning, and the ultimate vindication. It had been a difficult path, filled with emotional turbulence, but it had reinforced lessons that were both timeless and invaluable. Life was unpredictable, people were flawed, and even family could fail you in ways that were unimaginable. But preparedness, integrity, and calm determination could overcome even the most personal betrayals. As the sun set over the house, casting a warm glow over the garden and the rooms within, I felt a sense of completion. This was more than a victory, it was a reclamation of life, a testament to the strength of character and the enduring power of love and memory. The house, our home, would continue to be a place of joy, laughter, and sanctuary for those who deserved it. And in that quiet moment, I understood that I had not only protected a physical space, but also preserved the essence of family, of legacy, and of the values that Susan and I had lived by. Mark and Jenna's choices had led them astray, but they had also provided an opportunity for lessons, reflection, and the eventual restoration of order and respect. I smiled softly, watching my granddaughter run across the lawn, her laughter echoing through the air. The house was safe, the memories intact, and the future secure. And I knew, with a quiet certainty, that integrity, patience, and resolve would always outlast deceit and greed.